Good evening and welcome to Praise of Folly. I'm your host for this evening, Keith Preston. With me this evening are Todd Lewis, who is the regular host of the program, and also two very special guests, Andy Nowicki and Colin Liddell from Alternative Right and a number of other places where they publish their work or do podcasting. So welcome to the program, everyone.
Yep, happy to be here.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
Okay, so what we're going to be talking about this evening is the alternative right, and we're going to be looking at the alternative right from somewhat of a critical perspective in the sense of, well, what is the alternative right and where's it going, and would perhaps some criticisms of the alternative right and what defenses can be made of the alternative right. And I know Todd has some questions that he'd like to ask. So Todd, why don't you just start firing away with some questions?
Sure. To avoid confusion, I'm going to start off with the definition of the alternative right that Ramsey Paul gave on the Amarin conference on the video that you guys put up on your alternative right, I think, .blogspot website. And I think that's a pretty generic and acceptable definition. One of the points that I find is somewhat problematic is I keep on forgetting his name. Who's that Croatian guy from the alt-right?
Tom Suvic?
Sunik, thank you. Tomislav Sunik.
Yes.
He mentioned once I used to listen to The Voice of Reason back when it was an actual radio show. It was like 4 years ago now. That's where I first heard about you, Keith Preston, by the way.
Well, Tom's program was the first podcast I was ever on, actually.
Well, Tom Slunik said that he represented a kind of pagan Europe, but by pagan Europe he meant something like, the intellectuals of ancient classical Greece and Rome, like Aristotle and Cicero, and a more sort of intellectualized and respectable paganism. And I think to myself, like C.S. Lewis did in his Screwtape Letters, if only that were true. I feel like that while the alternative right has a kind of a fascination and a kind of a pagan aesthetic, if you will, it's in the sense that Sunik talks about pagan, they're not really pagan. Classical Greek philosophy had, of course, many different schools of thought, but the big, I guess you could say the big four, Stoicism, Epicureanism, Aristotelianism, and Platonism, all represented a kind of moderation, the human will triumphing over the animal passions, right? There's the Platonic tripartite soul, reason, passion, and will, right? So, you have the rational soul that governs the body, and then you have this kind of spirited, almost like the soldier. So, right, in Plato's Republic, you have the philosopher kings, who are the rational, the timocracy, which is the spirited element, and the appetitive element is the oligarchy and democracy. And in many ways, the modern-day alt-right seems to be dominated by a kind of pleonexia, which was, in Greek philosophy, was kind of an unrestrained hedonism. And if you read, like, the Platonic dialogues...
Milo, I think, by now, yeah.
What?
You seem to be referring to Milo Yiannopoulos.
Well, not necessarily Milo, but they claim that they're pagan in the intellectualized sense of the big four, but they're not, and it's like I think that's a problem because the big.
When you say they, when you're talking about the alt-right, you say they, and then that immediately kind of presupposes that they're a very unified group that agree with each other. So.
No, you're right. They don't. The alternative right is a very wide and.
That's what gives it its pagan character, really. It's this very polymorphous. It has many manifestations. It's not unified in a very Judaic, centralized way.
Well, okay. Let me maybe rephrase the objection a little bit. Classical pagan philosophy, at least in the big four that I mentioned, is the idea that there's the Greek nous, the reason of the will. That's the highest level of the tripartite soul. And the kind of there was a hedonistic philosophy. It was called hedonism, and to some extent also the Cynics were hedonistic. But they're pagan only in this one sense. I mean, you don't see a lot of Neoplatonists or Aristotelians or Stoics walking around in the alt-right. At least I haven't seen them. Maybe I haven't seen enough of the alt-right to know to see them at all. But it does seem that the alt-right that is pagan isn't pagan in the sense of the sophisticated sense that Sunik talks about. Even Sunik himself is kind of a pleasure-seeking Pleonexiast. Which,
yeah, well, there's a kind of distinction, I think, that needs to be maybe emphasized between the alt-right and the neo-reaction movement. I think the neo-reaction movement was kind of very ostensibly intellectualized, and they did bring in a lot of philosophy, and those are the people that used to read the books about Evola and Nietzsche and Heidegger, and they wanted to bring all that in, both to sort of signal their kind of intellectual quality, but so they had various motivations to do that. On one level, it was a kind of sincere attempt to try to tackle deep philosophical issues. On another level, it was an attempt to signal intellectual worthiness, which kind of suggests something like an inferiority complex against the prevailing hegemonic belief system.
Andy, do you have any comments on this?
Yeah, well, I was wondering, I was curious to know more about your observation that the alt-right is primarily hedonistic. Can you give some examples of this, and tell how these examples constitute a general philosophy or mindset that emphasizes pleasure seeking?
Sure. There's two levels, right? There's the kind of crass, vulgar level of the comment section, which maybe we could just say is beyond the pale, and we could ignore that. But to some extent, that is a measure of the rank and file. But let's stick to a more sophisticated level. Someone like Tomislav Sunik, someone like Greg Johnson, or Richard Spencer, or Jack Donovan. In a lot of ways, if you read Countercurrents, I've followed the. I discovered the alternative right probably when when Andy and Colin and Spencer all created the original alternative right website around 2011. And that's when I first discovered what the alternative right was. And then from there, I discovered, as short-lived as it was, the Voice of Reason, and then Radix Journal and Countercurrents and other groups. But there's this kind of, for instance, Sunik himself, I think, is an example of a kind of hedonist, right? I remember this one speech he gave talking about the Greek gods, and even the Platonists were kind of embarrassed at a very literal interpretation of the Iliad. They kind of thought, well, that's got to be kind of allegorical. That's so sensual and humanistic, it's kind of beneath us. So when Sunik is telling me that he wants to be a sophisticated pagan, like a Platonist or a Stoic or an Epicurean or a Ciceroean, but then he at the same time appeals to a kind of crass, sensual paganism that we see in like cinema, I'm like, it's like cross messages here. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, I don't know Sunich's thought all that well, I'll admit. The other people that you've listed off, I mean, I have my differences with them, and I think if I am in the alt-right, I'm a very atypical example of the alt-right. So that's probably par for the course for me. But I don't. I mean, that said, I don't know if I would define any of the people that you mentioned as primarily hedonistic. I mean, I do think if you want to critique them for being, let's say, godless, I think that would work. That would stick. I don't know if that's your critique or not. There are other things you can say about Richard Spencer and Jack Donovan, and I don't know some of the other people that you that you mentioned. Hedonistic would not be the term I would use. Now, what you said about the comment section, I guess I'd like to, or you know, people's posts on the comment pages, that and how they constitute a kind of baseness and vulgarity in many cases, even if they're funny sometimes. That is one thing that you said that does resonate with me. So I'm interested to know more about that. Like, where do you read these comments that have this kind of effect on you, that make you think?
Oh, sure. Well, for me, primarily places like Radix Journal and the Right Stuff Biz. I don't read them much anymore, but
Yeah.
let me rephrase it a little bit. I do have multiple levels of critique, but I want to kind of start on their own terms. Because I think when Sunik said that he's a pagan in the sophisticated sense, I think Sunik was serious. I think he meant to be taken seriously at that level, and I do. But what I am saying is, if you look at the big four, let me rephrase it a little bit. Hedonism might be too strong of a word. But in ancient Greek philosophy, pleonexia was the idea that pleasure was a principle that should be pursued above virtue, or above, actually it was virtuous to pursue pleasure as itself. But whereas you look at Platonism, specifically Platonism, but also Stoicism and Aristotelianism, again, classic pagan philosophies of which I have great respect for, even though I wouldn't identify as a Platonist or a per se or an Aristotelian per se, but I have respect for those traditions. They would all agree that pleasure itself, I mean, Aristotle said the wise man does not seek to maximize pleasure, but he seeks to avoid pain. And, you know, Platonists, the Neoplatonists themselves were actually borderline ascetic. They were almost Buddhists in their self-abnegation from the world when it came to the pleasure of the bed or the table or the wine bottle. Really, the alternative right, at least as I see with the comment sections, but also even with the more sophisticated leadership, doesn't really take that line. They claim they're pagans in the sophisticated sense, and I don't see that. I don't see a kind of sophisticated Neoplatonic, you know, or Aristotelian rejection of physical delights. I almost wish they were actually a sophisticated pagan.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think you're correct in saying that these people, these writers, these I don't know, columnists, thinkers, speakers, what have you, that they aren't Neoplatonists and they aren't Aristotelians and so forth. I don't know if I would. I don't want to get too hung up on definitions here. You know, I don't want to go back and forth in some kind of tiresome way, you know, defining terms and so forth. But I don't think the emphasis would be on hedonism. Although, you know, I do think that maybe something. I think there's you know, in what I would consider an improper ordering of values, or just again from my perspective, in a lot of this thinking that we're talking about here. But I'm curious to know more about your critique and the various levels of it. I know you started out with on this subject of saying you wish that they were, you know, they present themselves as pagans, and I think when they present themselves as pagans, my impression isn't that they are, and maybe Colin can fill us in here because I think Colin is a self-professed pagan himself. I don't think that means the Aristotelian or ancient Greek or Platonic sense of paganism, like the high paganism of the you know, the Hellenistic age. I don't think that's what they're what constitutes their general philosophy.
No, so, I would say you're right, but I would say that Sunik, though, does directly appeal to the high paganism. The paganism of the New Right tends to be more Germanic or Norse, and that might be a segue to another critique, is a kind of maybe anti-intellectualism. I've heard Greg Johnson say directly that even Hellenism itself is an anti-white universalistic doctrine, much like Christianity. And they think, well, if you're not Christian, you're not Hellenist, I'm hard pressed to figure out how you're European at all, because from, I don't know, the end of the Greek Dark Ages in 750 BC up until the age of Constantine, for about 1,000 years, Hellenism was the dominant position in the West. And then from Constantine until the French Revolution, Christianity was the dominant position. But he's also not a liberal. So he rejects the three main strands of European history. And I'm like, well, how are you European if you reject Hellenism, Christianity, and liberalism? To me, that seems like it's almost anti-European.
Well, Greg,
Colin,
I think Greg specifically identifies as a National Socialist, doesn't he? I mean, doesn't Greg claim to actually be a National Socialist? So I think that
I'm not sure he does, actually.
I'm pretty sure he does. I reviewed one of his books once. I think he's pretty much in that vein of thought. So it makes sense he would appeal to Germanic paganism over these other things.
Well, yeah, Greg strikes me as mainly a liberal, but with white nationalism added to cover up the inevitable defects of liberalism.
That's probably true.
How do you mean that, Colin? Can you elaborate?
Yeah, most of his positions do seem to be quite. He's very much a swipple, in cultural terms and the way he comes across. But there's this one hard nationalistic edge to him, and I think that might seem like a contradiction to most people. But in a way, it makes perfect sense, because liberalism has very, very fatal flaws that need to be addressed. And once you take that kind of liberalistic, materialistic, and of course hedonistic approach to life, which is implicit in liberalism, then you start to actually destroy yourself, and then therefore counterbalance that. And in Greg's case, obviously it's white nationalism, and that's a very interesting kind of synthesis there, I believe.
Just as a heads up, I'm getting a lot of interference coming from somewhere. Like there's a lot of background noise. I'm not sure where that's coming from. I don't know if there's any way to fix that, or if there's any issues with the.
People need to mute their microphones when they're not actually speaking.
Yeah, that's a way to cut back on background noise. When you're not talking, it's probably best to mute your microphone. But
I have a question. Listening to this conversation, perhaps we should start by trying to come up with an actual working definition of what the alt-right is. Somebody asked me that a while back, and I'm like, well, it's just a wide range of philosophies that reject the left and reject mainstream conservatism, and beyond that, I'm hard pressed to really put a label on it, because it includes everything from white nationalism to race realism to neo-eugenicism to the neo-reactionary movement to HBD enthusiasts to Catholic traditionalists and neo-pagans and Satanists, and I've come across all kinds of things in the alt-right. I don't even know that it's all, in many ways, it's not even a movement. It's just sort of a mixture of people with all different kinds of ideas that perhaps have this handful of things in common: critiques of mainstream society and mainstream conservatism and the left. But so why don't we try to come up with some kind of working definition of what the alt-right is?
Well, okay, let me see if I can come up with some terms that they agree on, and we'll see if Andy and Colin agree with us. I think whatever your position, whatever your personal beliefs are, the alt-right agrees on these positive points. There are objective differences between the sexes. There are objective differences between the races. There are objective differences between individuals. Some are smarter than others. Some are more beautiful than others. Some are stronger than others. These objective differences are real. Nature itself is inegalitarian. And I actually think I heard Colin say this a couple of times before in other podcasts, that if nature's inegalitarian, then it doesn't make sense that we should kind of fight the tide of nature. And these are positive things that I think that all of the alt-right agrees on, whatever their private views are. Would you agree with that assessment, Andy and Colin?
Yeah, I think so. I think that's a pretty good relation of various tenets that I think all the different factions probably hold to. And when you say objective differences between the races and the sexes, um, I would maybe rephrase that as biological differences
Sure,
between the
sure.
races and the sexes. Um, but other than that, I think it's perfect.
I guess by objective I meant real and substantive differences.
Yes, that too.
So I guess I think that if you define a movement purely negatively, you don't get very far. You have to define what the movement's for, what it actually believes. And I think I gave a sweep of positive positions that everybody in the movement holds. Do you agree with that too, Colin?
Yeah, yes. Those are very obvious points. Actually, I think they're points that almost any human being implicitly acknowledges in one way or another. So even leftists, even though they might be in a state of denial, they actually live by a lot of those kind of rules themselves. So that's not really saying too much, I think.
That may not be, but what I just guessed because I think I can't think of his name now. The guy that wrote Animal Farm, but he said that telling truth
Orwell.
Telling truth in the age of lies is itself a revolutionary action. So, well, it may not be very hard to comprehend. It's kind of revolutionary, though, in an age of lies, right?
Yeah, and those are things that people, maybe everybody believes, but nobody admits to believing those things, or hardly anybody does. So,
well, exactly.
That's significant.
Why do we live in such an age of lies? So that's the question that naturally suggests itself.
Well, yeah, there's a lot of reasons for that. Partly, I think it's because the powers that be have set up a structure system that they derive power from denying those truths. Now, that again, we have to ask ourselves, how do those powers that be come to power in the first place? And you pointed this out, actually, Colin, in your one of your interviews on Red Ice Radio, specifically with the rise of the Jewish state. Well, there was an active intelligence behind it. There was a lot of essentially chance occurrences, right? I mean, Turkey had to side with Germany. Turkey had to lose a world war. If it didn't happen, the Balfour Declaration wouldn't have happened. And, that wouldn't have laid the groundwork for Jewish settlement. So there's a lot of...
Yes, a lot of history is basically accidental. And so that undercuts people who believe in these very, very elaborate conspiracy theories that are finally worked out in every detail. They're not. Things bump along and, chance occurrences throw things one way or the other.
Yeah, exactly. Let me preface this objection in this sense. It's not true of all the alt-right. As you said, it's a diverse movement. But there are certain elements, and I think you might agree with this criticism, at least I think Andy might, certain elements of the alt-right that tend to be what I call racial reductionists. So, for example, let's first talk about reductionism. You have Marxist reductionism, where if you get rid of capitalism in the state and, the evil patriarchy, we're all going to be this happy, wonderful, communist, stateless society. Well, that didn't really work out that way. It just didn't. And I think a lot of people on the alt-right, they say if you get rid of the Jews, you get rid of the liberals, you have an all-white society, we can even make communism work. I don't think any society can make communism work, white or not, but I feel that's a kind of reductionism analogous to communism in some quarters of the alternative right, where they have these kind of just so narratives, and if we just remove the right people, we'll all be kosher. And to me, it almost has a communist flavor to it, where if we just got rid of the capitalists and the church and the state, we'd all be good. And I feel like it doesn't help the movement.
I'd say that, yeah, I would agree that there's an overemphasis on, to me anyway, just speaking for myself, on racial solidarity and an overemphasis on race in general, which isn't to say that race isn't isn't important in many ways, and today, of course, you're not supposed to believe that race even exists, and to believe that it does exist is to be, to render yourself a highly suspect individual, and so forth. It's a great heresy to believe in inherent racial differences, but I would say, what I get from what you just said is where I would agree with you is I think there is an overemphasis on it. It's almost, to me, going to the opposite extreme, equally irrational. Well, maybe not equally. I don't want to draw an exact parallel there necessarily, intellectually speaking, but it seems irrational as well to say race is everything, as it is to say race doesn't exist, race is nothing.
Well, exactly. I guess. Sorry, go ahead, Colin.
I'd like to just cut in and say that I don't really think it is exaggerated. I mean, all right, it is in a sense it is slightly retarded to attribute everything to race, but the fact that a lot of people are very, very concerned about race and even obsessed about race is completely understandable in the light of the very, very dramatic and radical demographic changes that are going on. And of course, a lot of people they kind of see this as part of a great conspiracy, and that that focus on race leads them into other errors. But that kind of paranoia, if you want to call it that, might actually be very, very logical in the end game. You know what I mean? So an area can sometimes be very productive of beneficial results. And I think we really do need to be concerned about being replaced by other cultures. I mean, I know it's not all due to the Jews or this or that kind of reductionist racial theory, but that kind of paranoia could actually be quite healthy in a way, in making people much more aware. And one of the things that we lack is this sense of unity. We just don't have that in modern Western societies, and we have to kind of find a roundabout way of getting that back. So, if you look at all that together, the fact that white countries are being effectively colonized by third world populations, and that whites are being pushed down year after year, and their spaces are being taken over, to not actually be paranoid is, to my mind, very unnatural.
I would say that we have to be careful, though. I mean, I agree with what you said. I mean, and it is happening across the West, and it is something. It is definitely an area of concern. And I think what's worse, actually for me, worse than the clear attempt at demographic displacement, as bad as that is, what bothers me more is that you can't talk about it, and that somehow mentioning it is a hate crime. I mean, that troubles me on a much more visceral level than even the invasion itself. But in any case, I would say we have to be careful when we talk about white genocide and whatever other terms that are often used to describe what's going on. I mean, there are white people who are fully in support of this trend, and the people who are in power in the West are mostly white, and they're pushing for this. I mean, and not Jewish either. I mean, you want the canard, to me. I mean, it's not a total canard, because we should be able to talk about Jewish influence, but there are plenty of non-Jewish whites who are, in charge, in power, at one level or another, and they're promoting this displacement. And to me, they are the real enemies. They're the ones, the elites, the ones who are in charge of what's going on right now, in charge of marshaling these trends. I think we should we should blame them and focus our energy and our anger against them, and not
Yeah,
against the immigrants per se.
Blaming them is quite difficult because really they're just agents of certain economic forces as well, and this sort of materialistic outlook of the entire West. So blaming anybody is almost a bit pointless. But what needs to happen? There needs to be a kind of collective emotional reaction against things, and trying to run everything on a very kind of cerebral and rational basis is not how things happen in the history of the world. So just let all the poisons hatch out of the mud as they will.
Well, let me maybe explain something real quick. By racial reductionism, let me give a concrete example. I think there's been a small misunderstanding here. For example, if you look at, say, the likes of, say, Countercurrents or Radix Journal or even the Right Stuff Biz, they talk about European civilization, and they talk about white civilization. And they say that, white civilization did X, Y, and Z, and isn't that wonderful? And at the same time, though, there's this kind of like anti-Christian element to it. So it's like, well, okay, so you kind of reject the last 2,000 years of our history, but still accept it at the same time. But here's a concrete example. In the year 0 AD, China and Rome were roughly equally developed in culture, science, technology, architecture, civilization, in every possible matrix. China might have been slightly a little bit more developed than Rome. And in fact, until what historians and sociologists call the Great Divergence, which occurred around 1500, Europe, except during the Roman era, was not much to brag about, actually, compared to the Near East and India and China and even Mesoamerica. Until around 1500, Europe could reach parity with, like, say, the Romans, but generally was not even as high as China or India. Now, if there's this inherent whiteness, that this is the racial reductionism that makes Europe great. And according to the alternative right, I don't know, the white race has been around for 20,000, 30,000 years. Why did it take? What was the last 500 years that the white race embodied all of these superlative qualities? When for most of that time it was no better off than the Chinese or the Indians or the Egyptians. I feel like the problem here is that when you look at the Great Divergence, they don't have an answer. The answer for the Great Divergence is less racial and more of a cultural, religious aspect. As a Christian, I would tend to explain the Great Divergence as a result of the influences of Christianity. The reason why it didn't happen sooner was in part due to barbarian invasions that kept on keeping Europe.
If you say that, then you have to explain how Christianity led to that higher level of technology and achievement.
Well, sure. I mean, I can do that, but just for the sake of argument, though, let's just look at the race issue. The race issue alone cannot explain the Great Divergence, and that's where I find this racial reductionism problematic. That's a separate question from how Christianity did it, which I can answer, but I would just like to kind of get your first response to the racial reductionism and its inability to answer the problem of the Great Divergence.
Well, I think you actually could explain the Great Divergence by reference to racial differences, and I mean the way to do that, you could say that the aspects of white people's nature that led to their achievements also held them back earlier on. And so, if you think about what are the main differences now, East Asian people, they they have slightly higher IQ, so they say. With Western people, there's more of a spread of IQ. So we have more stupid people and more very intelligent people. White people tend to be more aggressive. So there's various things you could sort of zoom in on, and you could say, like, okay, those characteristics could have promoted internecine warfare that could have held a society back, but under different circumstances, when things had stabilized, those factors then pushed the white race forward. And you can also see that in terms of the kind of political organization. China always consolidated it into a large centralized state covering almost the entire area of their civilization, whereas white people, we tended to be divided into separate competing states, and you can see how that would help to drive quality.
Well, I think that's a good argument, but I think that is more of a cultural argument than a racial argument. Because the Roman Empire was this large, homogeneous state like China, and it was the production of European civilization. In fact,
yeah, it was an exception.
Even Aristotle himself believed that the universal state was the kind of end goal. And that's what Alexander tried to actually create the universal empire that Aristotle envisioned, but he failed. It was the Romans that actually succeeded in creating this universal. It's almost like a universal human dream. Whether you're in China, India, Europe, the Middle East, or Mexico, this universal human kingdom is a kind of a dream that all men have. Some men are better at achieving it than others.
It wasn't much of a dream for my ancestors. You know, on the north side of Hadrian's Wall.
Well, that's true, and it wasn't much of a dream for the people on the north side of the Chinese Wall either. But I guess within each ethnic group, the Asiatics, the whites, the Arabs, the American Indians, there's an element that represents that universalistic dream. Andy, what are some of your
power? Isn't it? It's more about the nature of power. Power always wants to expand itself, and we see that today, really, with this kind of globalist Western kind of anti-racial empire.
Yeah, but Andy, I kind of want to get some of your insights on this.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think about these thoughts or things you have to say about what we just talked about?
Well, with regard to the Great Divergence, I mean, what you're calling the Great Divergence, you know, I would ask things because I'm a artsy, literary kind of guy, I guess, if I were to describe myself. And when you talk about what happened 500 years ago in the West, the first thing I think of is Shakespeare.
Yeah.
And maybe that's taking things in a different direction than what you're talking about. You're talking about technological advancements that have happened in the last 500 years in the West as opposed to other places in the world. I would ask, what is it about? What is it? You know, are there other? Yeah, I mean, there's great literature in China and in Japan and other places, but is there an equivalent to a figure like Shakespeare or somebody like Dante or others? These kinds of giants of the West. Is there any equivalent to that in any other culture? That, I mean, when I say equivalent, I don't just mean somebody else, another writer who's renowned, but somebody else with that same kind of insight. I mean, and that same kind of vision. And I would argue that's part of what makes the West unique, is that it has been able to produce art of that kind, which isn't, again, it's not to say that there isn't, you know, great art to be found all across the world, but I think there's something unique in the West. And
so, Andy, would you say that's a kind of racial characteristic?
Well, it could be. I mean, that's a good question. I mean, is it a racial characteristic? I don't think it's a racial characteristic exclusively, because there are westernized. There are people in the West who live in the West now, who are whose origin is elsewhere, but they are just as Western in their, you know, perspective and you know, and way of looking at things, and you know, as any native Westerner, as anyone whose roots are in the West, and they seem to be able to. Some of them seem to be able to glom on to what's significant, you know, about Western art or Western culture. So I would say it's not exclusively, it can't exclusively be racial, but maybe there is something in the composition of, let's say, the white man, for lack of a better word, with regard to notions of individuality, individualism, and I'm not necessarily promoting individualism. I'm not promoting radical individualism, but I think that maybe there's something in the West that values that perspective in a way that really isn't seen elsewhere in the world, and that's both. Yeah, I think that it might have been Jared Taylor who made this observation, but I remember whoever made it, I kind of filtered it through my own perspective, and it came to me that the West is the only place that where liberalism actually exists. And when we talk about liberalism, I mean both good, what could be called good liberalism and bad liberalism. And so only the West could create the kind of societies that we have where there is such concern for freedom or for individual dignity and humanity and humane treatment and all this kind of stuff. But on the other hand, only the West could, in we could say a degenerate state, could have created the culture we have now, where there seems to be this suicidal trend to this inclination to almost want to sacrifice your own birthright because it just wouldn't be nice to exclude foreigners. So
yeah, you brought up a lot of interesting points, Andy.
Well, here's a question. If I may interrupt, here's a question
Sure.
I'd like to ask Andy. I know that Todd and Andy both come at some of these questions from a Christian perspective, although Andy I know is Catholic and Todd is Protestant. But Andy, how do you see Christianity as playing a role in this? Because I know for Todd's outlook is very Christian centric. I mean, he considers Christianity to really be the fundamental building block of Western civilization, if I understand his views correctly. And how would you fit Christianity into this, Andy?
Well, clearly, I mean, I would say that in the and I'm no historian. I don't want to talk above my pay grade here, but just because I'm being asked this question, I mean, Todd was talking earlier about pagan Greece, in the high paganism of the Hellenic age, and clearly there was, before Christianity, there was already something like this impulse was there, in the Western world. Now, a lot of these ancient cultures in the ancient Greece and ancient Rome they had a lot of aspects that we would consider barbaric, and we would definitely see certain things about them as objectionable. But there was what we could say an enlightened element to these cultures, pre-Christian, that's already there, that maybe argues that there's something more, if not racial, then cultural. And where does the culture, where does that cultural influence come from? Well, that's the question. Now, with the advent of Christianity, I would say that there's definitely more concern with individual souls. It's only after Christianity that abortion becomes thought of as an abomination, and the whole development of the rules of just war theory, whereby there are formulations made that you can't just go and wipe out another country and kill all the women and children and so forth. Which isn't to say it didn't happen, frequently, but the point is there was the development of this doctrine that emphasize the importance of individual lives and of sparing civilian lives, as you know, and making a distinction between civilian lives and you know the lives of people who are actually fighting the war. You know, protecting yourself, fighting. You know, the notion of self-defense as opposed to indiscriminate killing, and it's okay because you know he who has the gold makes the rules. You know, that whole notion. I mean, a lot of these. What I'm saying is a lot of these ideas came along because of Christianity, but they were there uh, in some way prior to Christianity as well. So that would be my answer. I would say, you know, a little bit yes, a little bit no.
There's a couple of things here, Andy, about the Great Divergence. In some sense, it is technological, but as far as culture, you asked about Shakespeare. Is there? Well, I would also say that Shakespeare is deeply Christian in many ways, and that makes him unique. Because if you look at, say, ancient Greek and Roman literature, which is good stuff. I mean, I'm not going to knock it, but if you look at like the Greek tragedies and the Roman philosophy, you know, the Greek and Roman philosophical works, the tragedies, the plays, the level of sophistication. I mean, if you read that stuff, and then you read like the Epic of Gilgamesh and the 1001 Nights, you know, from the Islamic tradition, or if you read, say, you know, the Chinese, the three romances, the Romance of the Three Kingdoms. I never read it, but I heard it's one of the great classics of Chinese literature. You know, and if you read the Epic of the Kings, medieval Islamic translation of Zoroastrian Persian mythology, that stuff is just as riveting as anything I read in the Iliad. I've read segments of the Epics of the Kings, where Rostram, the great hero, is fighting off his villains, and there's all these great human tragedies that we find in the Iliad. I find there's a kind of perennialism amongst pagan cultures, China, India, Europe, the Middle East. There's this kind of perennial equality, that the best of China, the Middle East, India, Europe is roughly equivalent. But when you get to the Christian age, there's this level of complexity, introspection, that, well, as a historical fact, Augustine invented the idea of the self. I mean, his autobiography, The Confessions, is the first autobiography in history, and that's, of course, due to his Christian values. The idea of the self, the individual that introspects. There might have been Greek shadows or premonitions with like Plato, because I mean, Augustine himself was in some sense influenced by Platonism. He was a Manichaean in his youth, which was a kind of Platonic Jewish philosophical hybrid. But you don't see the idea of the individual self until Christianity. That's the invention of Christianity, and that's just a historical fact. The other thing you don't see until Christianity is the advent of the scientific method, which is invented actually in the Middle Ages by the the Catholic English philosopher, metaphysician, I think it was Roger Bacon. And he actually had a stipend from the Pope to do scientific research. And so we don't see anywhere else in the world until Christendom this flowering of science and culture, this level of complexity, this level of depth, which makes me question the racial reductionism. Because if I read Roman literature and I read about Roman science, it's no more or no less sophisticated than Chinese literature. In fact, Chinese science is probably slightly more advanced. The Chinese invented gunpowder before the West. The Chinese had, you know, advanced mechanical machines before the West. So on a purely perennial pagan level, I see them as all, the best of them are roughly equivalent. But
yeah,
I think
I'd just like to cut in here and say that, of course, we can't really speak with absolute authority about the pagan civilization that predated Christianity, because the Christians who took over took special pains to expurgate large parts of that culture. And then regarding Shakespeare, of course, I think some reference should be made to the fact that about half of his plots and plays were based upon the work of Plutarch.
As far as Shakespeare, you're correct. Coriolanus and Julius Caesar were both lifted straight out of Plutarch. But I would argue there's a kind of level of Christian introspection that we find in Shakespeare, and not just Shakespeare, but his entire generation, that is unique to that post-pagan world. And as far as
well, yeah, I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that Christianity existed as a specific class in contradistinction to the kind of the more typical ruling elites who historically have always been more military based. And so with the rise of the Catholic Church, you had something which was completely new in that respect. And so that was much more introspective. It was much more. It created certain values, not out of a love of those values themselves, but has a way to kind of compete with the other elites, which would be the military and the feudal and the kind of aristocratic elites.
Actually, Colin, you said something that I want to kind of launch off of as another critique. You mentioned the relationship to the Christian world and the pagan world, and this gets into another critique that I have of many elements, but not all elements of the alternative right. They're a kind of glorified fedora tipper. We have this narrative. A classic example of this would be Carl Sagan's Cosmos. He has an episode of Cosmos that deals with the Library of Alexandria. It's all very, melodramatic, and this glorious pagan past, and Christianity buried it in the dust. But modern scholarship, secular and otherwise, has largely debunked this Humean Gibbon myth. In fact, classical philosophy, classical thought was highly valued by medieval Christendom. Jerome, the 4th century church father, was actually very guilty of his love of classical texts. The Irish monks, in fact, most of our classical texts that we have now are preserved by Irish monks in the Dark Ages, in spite of the raids of Vikings and Saxons and other deleterious movements, which we wouldn't have otherwise. And then also, the rest of the texts that we have are the result of the Greek Christians in the Eastern Empire, which recorded all those texts and then later fled from the Turkish invaders in the 15th century. Who is
the most well-preserved classical author? And by which I mean, which author do we have the most works by?
Probably Plato, but Aristotle and Plato, I would guess, are probably the most preserved.
No, it's not. It's actually Galen.
The doctor.
Yes. So, obviously they found utility in what he wrote. There was a lot of medical knowledge they could exploit and use to, bolster the status of the church and so on. So I think what the Christians preserved of the pagan past was highly selective, and a lot of it, we just simply don't know what was destroyed or erased or just neglected into oblivion.
Well, actually, at this point here, Keith Preston, you might remember a few years ago on your channel, we did discuss this in great detail. Most of the pagan works that were destroyed by the invading barbarians of the West. In the East, these works were not forgotten. That's just a fact. They were not forgotten in the East, though. Again, when the Islamic nations invaded the Roman Empire in the East and destroyed it, then some loss was incurred, but what was preserved was brought to the West. But there was no loss of Greek classical knowledge in the East, which was a Roman Christian empire. So there's this whole kind of fedora tipping narrative of Christians destroyed classical knowledge is just bollocks. In the Eastern Roman Empire, there was no loss of knowledge of classical texts, because they read the original Greek all the way through the Middle Ages. Even if they had medieval Greek language that they spoke themselves, they could all read Aristotle and Plato, and this is never forgotten for them. For them, it's never forgotten. For the West, it was forgotten because
it didn't seem to have much effect, because And the Byzantine Empire was moribund for most of its history. It was always on a downward slope, except for a few brief upticks.
Well, again, that's not entirely fair. Modern scholarship in Byzantinology has demonstrated, for instance, with John Haldon, one of the leading modern-day scholars of Byzantine studies. The Byzantine Empire was fairly dynamic and evolving until around the Fourth Crusade. The Fourth Crusade was they had downturns. They had many downturns. They had the Persian Wars, the Islamic invasions under the Arabs after the generation of Muhammad. They had the Turks. They had many setbacks. But after the Fourth Crusade, the Byzantine Empire really kind of fell into a permanent decline. But any scholar of Byzantine history today, this is kind of a Gibbon myth, a decline and fall of the Roman Empire myth. The Eastern Empire was quite vibrant. In fact, if you were to go anywhere in the world in the 6th or 7th centuries, the leading center of global scholarship was Alexandria, which was a Roman city, which was again, this is another problem I have with the AltRight. Go ahead, sorry.
The Greek city, essentially.
What?
Yeah, Alexandria was essentially a Greek city.
Well, it was culturally Greek, but multi-ethnic. But what I'm saying is this, though: the leading intellectual center of the world was in the Eastern Roman Empire, and even after the conquest of Egypt by the Muslim world, the West only began to reach parity with the East. I'd say the 11th century, and then, beyond that, it began to grow exponentially beyond the East. And there are reasons for that. But I would say that if it hadn't been for the Irish monks in the Eastern Roman Empire, we wouldn't have classical Roman literature or Greek literature. It just wouldn't be there. And this is a general consensus amongst modern scholars that the reason why it was forgotten was when the Roman Empire in the West collapsed due to barbarian invasions, the whole civilization broke down. Everything just collapsed. And with repeated barbarian invasions from the East by Asiatic tribes, from the North by Scandinavian tribes, and from the South by Arabs, nobody could rebuild the wreckage until
I think,
the 11th.
I think the reason that so much of the kind of pagan literature disappeared when the civilization collapsed, it was mainly because at that point it was no longer actually valued. So pagan civilization had gone into its own decline, and that's why it actually fell. And part of that decline was espousing Christianity. That was a kind of symptom of that kind of civilizational decline and collapse, which happened before the actual physical collapse. And one of the reasons for that would probably be the Roman Empire itself, because the Roman Empire was a kind of imposition on the organic nature of peoples. I mean, you had all these organic nations that existed before the Roman Empire took them over, and they kind of imposed this totalitarian system on these countries. And that's what basically laid the groundwork for the collapse of that particular civilization. It didn't sort of respect its inherent structure and texture.
Well, Andy, you haven't said much yet. What are your thoughts on this kind of discussion about the influence on the West? Is it a cultural or a racial or Christian or whatnot?
Well, like I was indicating before, I'm tempted to say that there's a combination of explanations. I mean, I think Christianity can explain, some of the good that has taken place in the West as far as insights into morality and so forth. But it seems that there was an element that was there. I don't want to just repeat what I was saying before, but I'm afraid I don't know if I have much more to say about it unless you want to,
Well, let me rephrase the question. Do you accept or disagree with the proposition that there's a lot of fedora tipping in the alt-right based on a kind of gut anti-Christian bigotry that's unjustifiable? That's kind of where I was. That's kind of the objection I was developing.
Yes, I would agree with that wholeheartedly. Yes, I do. I do think that. Now, I mean, I'm I, I'm in favor of a broad church kind of, if you will, approach. I don't attack pagans or atheists uh, who are opposed to the same kind of cultural trend, pernicious cultural trends that I am, that that we see taking place right now, culturally speaking. So, I don't. I don't really engage in. I don't really like to engage in polemics, but as far as that goes, with cultural allies. But I do think, yes, there's a lot of just. I mean, there's a reasoned, uh, sophisticated kind of take on Christianity that I think is some people are capable of. But what I often see, and I've complained about this before, is just this kind of very crude and unsophisticated, not well thought out uh, take on Christianity as being just some Jew plot to make the West be supine to the rest of the world, and for some reason it's just taken 2,000 years to play itself out. And like 500 years ago, 400 years ago, 300 years ago, all these Christian countries in the West were, uh, very didn't they were what we would see today is very ethnocentric, right? They didn't there was no globalist impulse.
Andy, would you say that the Christian hierarchy has been subverted though by certain kind of globalist elements?
Yes, that has clearly happened. I'm tempted to think those are more Freemasonic uh, elements than Christian. Certainly, if you're referring to the current Pope or certain other leaders of the Church today, which I'm certainly not a big fan of, and some of the things that are being promoted among Catholicism, but it's not just Catholicism. But those are more reflections of the times. Those are not anything. My point is, look, if you want to make an informed, reasoned critique of Christianity, I don't object to that. But just this whole, blaming Christianity for the decline of the West is just absurd. I don't. It doesn't make sense to me that to blame the essence of Christianity.
It's just reductionist. I mean, it's just focusing on one aspect or one factor.
Here's an issue that I see with the argument that Christianity is the foundation of Western civilization. I remember when I was in college, I was had a class on the history of Africa, and I had this paper I wrote where I was writing about African Christianity, and I so did a lot of research on Christianity in Africa. And what I found is that Africa actually has more Christians than any other continent in the world, and they just about every kind of Christian denomination that there is represented in Africa. And I also saw some data the other day that indicated that fairly soon China may actually have the largest Christian population in the world. And if that in fact is true, if Christianity is actually more prevalent numerically in Africa than anywhere else, or if China now, or if the center of Christianity is being transferred to either to Asia or to the global South or whatever, it seems like that it would affect the cultural evolution of those particular places in a fairly significant way. But from what I can tell, it really hasn't done that. It doesn't really seem to have had that much of an impact in terms of its overall impact on cultural evolution. I mean, maybe it's had some impact here and there, but I don't really see that it's dramatically altered the character of any particular nation where it's become prevalent, either in Asia or in Africa or anywhere else. So that leads me to the view that in part at least, that the civilization of the West is something that that does predate Christianity in many ways. Now, I would see Western civilization as kind of like a set of building blocks. I mean, to have Western civilization, you can't really do without Christianity. You can't really do without antiquity, and you can't really do without the Enlightenment either. I think that all of those things form the sum total of what Western civilization is today. And I think if you simply went back in your time machine and pulled any of those out, you would have something that was dramatically different than what the West is today. But I tend to have a more, I guess you could say, a multifactorial interpretation of how Western civilization has evolved. I think that geography played a big role in the evolution of Western civilization. The fact that Westerners tended to be seafaring peoples to a large degree. I think that the fact that our Western civilization evolved in a relatively cold climate compared to some other parts of the world impacted the social evolution of the West. I think that the kinds of political and social structures that existed throughout much of Western history in different places actually played a role in cultural evolution. I think the Greek political system played a big role in the formulation of that civilization, and I think the medieval the political structures of the medieval period sort of laid the foundation for some of the things that came after that. So I don't really think we can reduce it certainly to merely religion or race either. I think that you have certain racial characteristics of Europeans that you don't find in other parts of the world. But then I don't know that there's any one racial characteristic of Europeans or Westerners that by itself could account for the kinds of cultural evolution we've seen in the West either. I think that there are a lot of ways, for example, in which Asian people are superior to Westerners, but at the same time, there's a lot of achievements that you've seen in the West that haven't really been replicated very well in Asia. So it seems to me that there's really a multifactorial convergence that's working in all of this.
Well, I would agree with many of your points, Keith. I guess maybe I'm trying to paddle on the other side against racial determinism. Maybe I'm overstating the case a bit. But I guess just as far as Asia and Africa goes, Europe, to be fair, wasn't transformed overnight either by Christianity. The habits of the Greeks and the Romans and the tribes of the north, the Celts and the Germans, took many centuries, actually. I mean, if we look at the history, it took many centuries for these people to be changed. So I wouldn't expect Africa to change overnight, necessarily. Europe didn't change overnight either. But your points are all well taken, I think.
Well, and I would say, I mean, to say that, yeah, and I think I would also add that, Keith, your overall take is definitely solid, and you put it, better than I could have put it. The multifaceted way that a culture is defined through history and the many elements that make up for it. But as far as Christianity not affecting the culture of other places in the world, I mean, I don't know. Like, if you look at some African tribe and say, well, they're still living in mud huts, and they're still wearing loincloths, and they're still chanting, and they still look the same. I mean, maybe that's true, but I would say, I would strongly suspect that an African tribe that's embraced Christianity is not going to be practicing, for instance, human sacrifice anymore, or doing various other things that you find these kinds of cold-blooded, barbaric elements that you would find in tribes that practice animism, so or such like. So, I mean, there's
Andy, you have heard of
you understand what I'm
the
saying?
Lord's Resistance Army, haven't you? Have you heard of the Lord's Resistance Army in Uganda? They're sort of like nominally Christian, but quite savage and barbaric in the way they operate.
Well, you can also find videos of witch burnings in Africa on YouTube. I've actually shown those to some of
Sure.
my students before. But yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say that African or Asian or whatever civilization has never been impacted by Christianity, even when it's become widespread. I mean, it certainly impacts certain things and on some level, but I mean, to say a religion can be introduced into a civilization without any impact at all is would be really silly, I think. But well, here's another example. Like I've actually studied, what some of the beliefs and practices of some African Christian religions are, and for one, there are some forms of Afro Christianity where you're actually expected to practice polygamy, and they say that, well, it's in the Bible, right? It's in the Old Testament.
Mhm.
Now, in the West, you don't see anything like that at all, but you do see that polygamy is a well-established tradition in much of Africa. So what they're doing is they're taking the Christianity that they're getting that's imported.
Syncretism, right?
Yeah, it's been imported from the West. Christianity has been imported from the West into Africa, and then they're reading the Bible and
Mhm.
or whatever they're looking at, the teachings of the church fathers or whatever, and they are giving it their own slant. In fact, I heard it said once that, well, of course, Christianity would travel well in Africa because that's an Old Testament society anyway. Um, or culture anyway. So it just seems to me that the cultural evolution that we've seen within Christianity in the West has assumed a different form than what we've seen, say, in Africa or in Asia. Like I've also noticed, for example, that Asian Christianity tends not to be quite as sectarian. For example, Western Christians, or at least American Christians, they'll have a split within a church, say, over some sort of doctrinal minutia. But in one thing I've seen is that in China you have people who are Christian, and while they're in China they go to the Baptist church, or in Korea or in Japan or in Taiwan. They go to the Baptist church, then they immigrate to the United States and they go to the Catholic church, and then they may have American friends or sponsors or whatever that are Baptists, and they say, "What are you going to the Catholic Church for?" And they say, "Well, it's all Christian, right? We believe in Jesus, right?" I mean, that's so, and I think that in turn is reflective of what you find in some of the Chinese folk religions, where one village might have its own set of gods, and the village up the street has its own set of gods, but it's all sort of connected in this kind of what ancestral tradition or whatever. And I think that kind of thinking kind of finds its way into Asian Christianity.
Yeah, I think maybe we diverted from the main topic a little bit. Colin kind of was letting me on about that, but I think the main point that I just wanted to get at was that I think we see a bit of fedora tipping, where some on the alternative right tend to resort to crude and unsophisticated atheist critiques. Even the pagans will resort to the same kind of critique. But maybe to get back more on track a little bit, though, is one of the things that I see, and I think this is more universal than just a particular segment of the alternative right, but what I kind of call maybe a science fetish. So for instance, back like in maybe the early 2000s, on YouTube, for instance, you might see atheists trolling Christians with evolution, and now you might see the alternative right trolling liberals with evolution, like we're the real Darwinists, or we're the real believers in science, or X, Y, and Z, or whatever. But and they'll invoke evolutionary psychology. That seems to be a really popular thing to invoke on the alternative right. But problem with that is, as I see it, even if true, it's irrelevant, because it's the fallacy of genetic fallacy, or as Moore called it, the materialistic fallacy, where because you can describe the origin or cause of a thing, you can then validate or invalidate a thing. And the other problem is the other side can do this too. Not just the alt-right, but the left as well. One of the things that George Gilder pointed out was that he thought he could use Darwinism to defend pro-marriage, pro-male, masculine values by appealing to, certain ape behavior. But then he realized you have, Desmond Morris's The Naked Ape and the Human Zoo, and Robert Andre's African Genesis, and then the imperial animal, and it's like, oh wait, oops, they can use that too. And in fact, Jack Donovan actually admits this implicitly in his distinction between the chimpanzee and the bonobo, when he talks about that in his On Men, or no, not On Men, but his little book about masculinity, and he talks about that as well. So, I mean, if you're a leftist, I think actually, in the big picture, Darwinism is on your side. Because if you control the environment long enough, you can have a bunch of passive, effeminate bonobos, which is what they want. And as Jack Donovan pointed out, nature provides with the chimpanzee and the bonobo. So the alt-right and the left can both appeal to nature. It's kind of pointless. It just kind of muddies the water. I think it's a kind of pointless virtue signaling that doesn't really advance the narrative.
I think that's a bit trite, though, because yeah, of course, if you control the environment for several million years, you produce certain results, and that's not what leftists believe. They believe that by moving things around a bit, you can change everything in a few generations.
I mean, the rational direction of evolution is something that both the National Socialists believed and the left, whether it's the left, key leftist thinkers like H.G. Wells and Bertrand Russell, were into
the major distinction, though, even though it is based on differences in time.
But the thing is, though, what both the alternative right, the National Socialists, which you might call the first alt-right, and the first left, people like Russell and Wells, they all agree that through human direction you could speed it up and direct it and manipulate it. And if that's true, and I mean, if that is a true thing, then they're both right. And it's all a matter of just who has the power to direct the outcomes.
Well, yeah, the left used to believe in things like eugenics when the left was truly progressive, but then they've backed away from that and they've just become skills for global corporatism.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is, this is kind of it's pointless. It's a genetic fallacy, because even if they were right, it doesn't prove anything. Just because it has been this way doesn't mean it should be this way. And if you think it should be this way, you need a different argument. And I think it's just kind of a muddying the waters and not helpful. And you see it a lot.
You're saying that people shouldn't do eugenics or evolution's a bad thing. What exactly are you saying, though?
What I'm saying is this. Okay, there's what's called the naturalistic fallacy, which was written about, I think, firstly by G.E. Moore. And the genetic fallacy is simply this: by arguing that the state of affairs that we have now should be preserved because we can explain through some genetic process how it occurred, it's therefore good. And that's exactly what the alt-right does. It's the classic example of the genetic fallacy.
You're saying the alt-right believes that evolution should stop now with the ultimate perfection of the white race. Is that what you're trying to say there?
No. What I'm saying is, when they argue for, like, say, feminism's bad because it's against evolution, or equality's bad because it's against, well, it's only bad in a certain sense. And again, if you control for certain variables, then you could direct evolution, which is actually the goal of the United Nations, actually, and I think to some extent still is. Then that's not necessarily true.
Has goals connected to evolution? That's news to me.
Oh yeah. The founding document, one of the founding documents of the United Nations, UNESCO, Its Purpose and Philosophy, written by Julian Huxley, the brother of Aldous Huxley. He states explicitly the goal of the UN is to scientifically direct the evolution of humanity. And that's
very much about it, I have to say. In fact, they've been going, full forward in the other direction.
Well, the other thing is those very self-same progressives in the 1930s were also for massive population reduction as the same part of the eugenic process, and that's still on course from what they predicted back in the 30s. But the fact is, this isn't about whether evolution.
I mean, a lot of these things are embedded in historical circumstances. I mean, the moves to reduce the population back then, actually, there was a kind of rationale behind that, which was we weren't so good at making food appear like we are now. The Green Revolution hadn't occurred, and so on. And so, there were legitimate concerns about overpopulation in those years. And now it's the obviously white people have the opposite problem, and everybody else still has the original problem.
Well, actually, that's not true. Demographic collapse is pretty much universal across the world. It's just at different stages. But the basic point is this: is that it's the naturalistic fallacy. So even if it is true,
I don't see Africa's population collapsing very much.
Well, not yet. But basically, what's
hopefully.
happening is the United Nations
they might get to that
systematically.
point by sheer overpopulation, they might well get to that point.
Well, what I'm actually the United Nations pursued a strict policy of population control. If you want to get loans from the IMF, according to actually goes back to Kissinger back in the 70s, you actually have to allow birth control to go into your country, and that's the whole point.
You are not conflating the IMF and the United Nations, though. They are slightly separate, I would say.
Well, they're separate institutions, but that's how the deal works. If you want to get IMF loans, you got to allow Planned Parenthood into your country. And in fact, India, under I think it was Indira Gandhi, practiced and forced.
That's the same economics they've been applying to the West. Basically, the IMF they want to lower the dependency rate, so they want to get more women in the workforce. And so if they're gonna lend money to a country, they want to get that money back, and they want it to be a successful loan. Therefore, they will do what they've been doing to the West, i.e., get women to stop having babies and get into the factories, because women looking after babies is not economics from their point of view.
Well, no, you're right. They do it in the West. What I'm saying is it's a global plan, and they've written about this in various literature sources that this is their global plan. But I think we've veered a little bit off topic. The main point is that a lot.
What happens when you try to conflate the alt-right with the left? I mean, that tends to push things a bit off topic.
Well, no. What do you mean with the old left? Well, no. I didn't conflate them. I said they both agreed that mankind could direct human evolution and speed up the process. You were saying that,
doesn't believe in that. The left,
no, you're right. But back then is what I'm saying. And so what I'm saying, the premise that I'm saying is, if you want to create the bonobo society the left does through eugenics, you could, but you could also create the society the alt-right wants. And that's kind of the point that I'm making. It goes either way.
One can determine the left is simply retarded. They just believe in Clyde Cuckoo land, really.
Okay, but Colin,
there's no sense of reality about what they're advocating and how to go about achieving it.
But you do accept the genetic fallacy as a fallacy, right? The naturalistic fallacy.
Well, you'll have to kind of clarify what you mean exactly.
Well, okay, I'll read you the actual direct definition of it. The naturalistic fallacy. So, naturalistic fallacy was, of course, okay, it's G.E. Moore's Principia Ethica. And then Moore argues that it would be fallacious to explain that which is good reductively in terms of natural processes, such as pleasant or desirable. Moore's naturalistic fallacies closely related to the Aesop problem. And what I'm saying is when the alternative right, and they tend to rely very heavily on evolutionary psychology to make their points, are in fact actually committing the naturalistic fallacy. And it's actually just a non-starter. You're not going anywhere. And that's, I think, a problem with the alternative right. If they want to demonstrate the problems of feminism and integration and all these things, committing the naturalistic fallacy is not the way to do it.
Well, that's such an ill-defined term that I neither agree or nor disagree with it.
Okay, Andy, what do you think about this criticism of the use of the naturalistic fallacy?
Well, I mean, I think I substantially understand what you're saying, and I don't know if I would have too much to add to it, but at the same time, I kind of I take what Colin is saying as well, as kind of sounding a cautionary note into not to, again, as we say, not to be too overly simplistic or to not understand that there are complications to every assertion. But I mean, the as far as your general your general understanding of the naturalistic fallacy, I mean, it sounds reasonable to me, and it sounds like something that, just like what you were talking about before with the quote unquote fedora tipping.
Yeah. I mean, there are good. I think you can make good arguments for these particular positions, but again, I feel like that by committing the genetic fallacy, well, it's a fallacy. You haven't proven your point. You're not going to convince anybody with that. And then the genetic fallacy or the naturalistic fallacy is not ill-defined. It's very well defined. G.E. Moore and others have defined it quite adequately. The problem is a lot of people aren't educated in the nature of formal and informal fallacies, and a lot of the alt-right, I think, seems to suffer from that lack of education between the formal and informal fallacies. They'll often commit both. And again, I gave a good example of one, the informal fallacy of the naturalistic. Oh, we just lost Andy. Hold on, let me re-invite him. Oh, he's back. He's back. Never mind. He's back. So yeah, that was just one of the points that I was gonna bring up about the critique of the alt-right. Now let's see. There was a couple of other points. So much has been brought up. There's other things I want to spring off of, but it's kind of gotten lost in the conversation. We've been talking over so many issues. Some of the other things. Maybe I'll just turn over to Andy and Colin for a little bit to kind of mull over this, and I'll try to remember some of the earlier threads that I wanted to pick up.
Well, I was just going to. Something happened just now. I think I got disconnected for a second. But I think there's a limit to trolling. I think there's a limit to, and it's part of what alienates me from the alt-right as it has come to be constituted. And I think that is this trolling culture taken to an extreme. Where the whole idea seems to be just to antagonize, and I mean I see I see a role to be played for shock value, and I see that there's value in antagonizing the enemy in certain cases, and there's certainly a value. I mean, what really drew me to the alt-right scene in the first place was my complete disgust and disappointment with the intellectual dishonesty of the left, as the left is constituted today, as the ascendant left, the censorious left, and so I understand the impulse to hit back, and I think there's a role to be played for I think satire, using some of the things that the left says today, and I'm comfortable speaking of the left as a monolith in this way, just because I do think that over the past, let's say, 10 years especially, it's hit such critical mass, and to the point where you can't just assert anything that's outside of a certain subset of what's considered acceptable opinion without losing your livelihood, losing your job, being castigated. It's absolutely obscene the way that things have gotten. But I think that all that said, and I don't mean to be so long-winded here, I'm just trying to say I understand the impulse to antagonize, to troll. I get it. But there's something to me that just turns me off about this culture now, where the whole idea seems to be, and the thing is, trolling can be done tastefully. I know that sounds funny to say because you think of trolling as something inherently untasteful, but I'm really not comfortable with, like certain things like saying, oh, this guy's a cuck, and then posting a picture of him with his adopted black son and saying, ha ha ha, look at him, he's so pathetic. I mean, I find that really kind of disgusting. And there is a trend towards doing things like that among alt-writers today that bothers me and frankly turns me off.
Well, that's also just kind of silly. I mean, Peter the Great adopted a black man. Well, was he a cuck too? I don't think so. But
Yeah.
Well, I've had a somewhat similar observation of the alt-right as what Andy was talking about. When I was present when the alt-right first got started. I remember the way I got involved with the alt-right was when Richard Spencer was the editor of Taki's Mag. I sent him an article I had written about critiquing the mainstream conservative movement and why it's basically a big failure. And he was impressed with that. So I started doing some work for him at Taki's, and then when he started Alternative Right, I was one of the first staff writers there. So I've been involved with the Alternative Right, or at least peripheral to it, since it began. And what I found interesting about the alt-right when it began was the idea of trying to develop an intellectual culture of the right, sort of an independent right that was totally independent of this mainstream conservative movement and all of that, and opposed to it. And also the idea of importing some ideas from the European right into the North American right, ideas that you get from Alain de Benoit and Ernst Junger and Carl Schmitt or Alexander Dugin and Guillaume Fay and all of these people. I thought, well, the American right could benefit from reading some of that, and so could the left, for that matter. So I was interested in forming a type of right that would pursue some of that. What I've seen in the last, say, 7 years or so is a steady degeneration of the right, and whether that's good or bad, I think is a subjective value judgment. But what I've seen is the alt-right go from talking about Alexander Dugin or Alain de Benoit, Guillaume Fay, to becoming more oriented towards 1920s style American racialism and eugenicism, like Madison Grant and Lawrence Stoddard and all of that kind of stuff. And then it's become this kind of thing that Andy talks about, this kind of Howard Stern of the right, all of this vulgar racial and sexual humor. And lastly, in more recent times, the alt-right has more or less become the Donald Trump fan club. So it's like in a mere 7 years, it's gone from Alain de Benoit to Donald Trump. Now, I predicted that would happen. In fact, I wrote an article for alt-right about 5 years ago that Richard asked me to write. He wanted me to write an article about Alex Jones, and given that Alex Jones's audience was so big, so what I wrote in that article was that Alex Jones would be the kind of vehicle that would actually popularize something like the alt-right. But to have an alt-right that had any kind of large audience, you'd have to really dumb it down to plebeian levels, and that's kind of what's happened now with this Donald Trump thing. I mean, Donald Trump is sort of the alt-right for plebes. It's and maybe that's a good thing, maybe it's a bad thing. I'm not really totally in that vein politically anyway. I'm, as far as my,
you're not on the Trump train yet.
No, well, not just that, but I mean, in terms of my association with the alt-right, I'm kind of an outlier. I'm kind of like the guy that's kind of on the edge of the alt-right, just kind of looking in some ways and kind of participating in certain ways. But so I'm not really even a right winger in any conventional sense. But but I have noticed that the alt-right has moved from that, in a mere 7 years, it's moved from sort of a highbrow intellectualism to sort of a more of a racial determinism of the type that Todd was talking about, to the kind of vulgarianism that Andy's talking about, and finally to Donald Trump. In fact, even if you go to the Wikipedia page for the alt-right, now not that Wikipedia is a credible source of information, but one thing that is interesting is that it says the unifying factor of the alt-right is support for Donald Trump, I personally think that the enthusiasm for Donald Trump that a lot of alt-right people have is misplaced. I think that at best, Donald Trump is reading from the standard playbook of the Republican Party that they've used for 45 years. He's doing with, Donald Trump is doing with the alt-right with what Nixon did with the hard hats, or or the Wallace supporters, or what Reagan did with the religious right. I think the alt-right is the alt-right segment that's big on Trump is kind of getting taken for a ride, I think, or maybe getting their hopes up too high or something like that. But I don't know that that's all of that is necessarily wrong, because if you want the alt-right to be a movement, then it has to be something that large numbers of people can relate to in some way. And most people aren't intellectuals. I mean, most Americans are never going to read Alain de Benoit or Alexander Dugin. It's never going to happen. So I suppose if the alt-right is to have any kind of influence on society, maybe that's the direction it needs to go in. As far as the vulgarians that Andy's talking about, I have mixed feelings about that, because another thing that interested me in the alt-right when it started, I saw it as a way of bringing some of this more intellectualized rightist thought into the North America, and I saw it as a means as well of sort of subverting the mainstream right, and I also saw it as a potential counterpart to these PC social justice warrior people. And I tend to be of the mind that the more extreme these social justice warrior people become, the more extreme their opponents need to become. And while I tend to share some of what Andy is saying, some of the concerns about some of the stuff that you see with the vulgarians on the alt-right, I kind of look like, well, for every social justice warrior, we need the kinds of folks we see in the comments threads on rightstuff.biz or something like that. Even though I don't personally agree with any of that, but it's it seems like they sort of balance each other out in a way.
Yeah, it's a bit like the way that fascism rose up to oppose the kind of totalitarian and violent tendencies of communism, and so the kind of trollish aspect of the alt-right has risen up to kind of counteract the neurotic behavior of the social justice warriors.
Well, one thing that I have found with these social justice warrior people is that there's no reasoning with them, and I think that, and even trying to debate them is a waste of time. I really think ridiculing them is the best way to go.
Very, very aware of. That's something I'd say the alt-right is very, very aware of, that people are not rational agents. They don't sit down, listen to the evidence and your logic, and then agree with you. That's something that almost everybody. Certainly the people who are very active on the internet are very, very aware of, and that's the whole point behind the triggering. You're actually recognizing how people argue, how it's all emotionally driven, and then you're just taunting them and triggering them to make them explode. And that's almost become like a kind of online sport for the alt-right.
Actually, Andy and Keith, you actually both brought up something that I would mean to get to, and pretty much said everything that I wanted to say. But this kind of anti-intellectualism that we've seen arising, specifically, I think you mentioned that, Keith, in the alternative right. And again, the left itself is anti-intellectual. I mean, for example, when the left makes an argument, they're never going to use a syllogism. They don't even know what a syllogism is, and half the time I doubt the alt-right does either. And I feel like that, to be a credible intellectual movement, you have to have that element of the rational core of debaters, the rational core of people that know how to put together an argument, know how to put together evidence, know how to, because basically if you're not using reason and evidence and logic, then you're just playing a game. We're not even really doing anything worthwhile. It's just a game.
It almost sounds like you're implying the alt-right doesn't have that.
Well, in a lot of, I mean, in a sense, it used to. I think it did back in 2011 and earlier.
The alt-right has both elements. It has very kind of erudite, rational people who are a bit long-winded and good at framing arguments and debating philosophies, and then you have the kind of the shitposting foot soldiers, and that's the you have to have that kind of dichotomy in any effective movement.
Well, I'm not saying that you don't you have to have a bunch of Plato brainiacs running in the movement. But
I mean, quite frankly, a lot of the intellectualism is surplus to requirements. I mean, why do we have to have a profound understanding of everything Alexander Dugin's written to be in favor of not being displaced by third world mass immigration? I mean, you don't really need to understand Heidegger to stand up for your very, very obvious basic interests.
Well, it's not quite that. What I'm saying is not quite that you have to read all these people.
I've just stated a very, very rational, syllogistic position I've just stated there. Can't really be argued with.
No. What I'm saying is, I'm not saying that you have to read. No, I'm not saying you have to read all these philosophers and know them inside out. What I'm saying is, if you have an
they're
argument,
well written.
No. What I'm saying is, if you're going to have an argument with somebody at any level, high or low, if you have the argument, you're going to have to use syllogisms. You're going to have to.
You have to determine what's driving them to have their opinion. Is it some sort of psychological thing? Are they emotionally driven? And then if they're a kind of a logical, fair-minded person, then you can start to unravel the data and the chains of logic. And if they're kind of a knee-jerk, neurotic, kind of emotionally driven asshole, then you just like troll the hell out of them.
Well, I mean, in one sense, you're right. You don't bother with people that aren't rational. But this actually gets to back to an earlier point of the certain reductionist elements that I see in the alternative right, that they'll give a kind of just so account of an event that isn't. For example, I don't know if you guys saw the Sargon of Akkad and Millennial Woes debate, the most recent one, where it was just those two guys. It wasn't anybody else. And I think that both sides were reductionist, and I criticize them both for that. But I feel like that in some senses. I mean, I can criticize Sargon, but that's for another time. That Millennial Woes too often rejected cultural explanations of problems and diversity issues, and then it just race. Well, no, you have to give an argument why. I mean, sometimes culture.
Been red pill too hard.
I mean, well, sometimes culture does account for these differences, and sometimes it doesn't. And so what I'm saying is, it's not only culture, it's not only race. Whereas, Sargon said it's only culture, Millennial Woes seem to be saying it was only race.
Not debating each other. That's going to sometimes polarize things more than they really should be. I mean, that's the nature of debates. Which is one of the drawbacks, really, because if you take a more complex position, then it leaves you open to cheap shots by somebody who's not arguing in good faith, and so there might have been a little bit of that.
I want to kind of ask Andy real quick, as far as this sort of anti-intellectual-ish critique that I've kind of sprung off you and Keith on, what are some of your perspectives?
Me? You're asking me?
Yeah, you.
Well, yeah, I will see. I don't know how I would exactly. I'm trying to think of how I would exactly respond to that, because I don't know if it's the unintellectualism per se that I object to in what I was talking about before. It's not, and it's not even vulgarianism per se, or vulgarness, because I understand the appeal of vulgarity, and vulgarity can be exquisitely clever, cleverly employed, and it can be interesting and it can be refreshing. To me, there is just, I mean, okay, I think that when you're up against lies and dishonesty and deceit and intellectual disingenuousness, the best response is truth, and that's what I mean. That's what I'm in it for. That's why I write. That's why I that's why I'm in the game, so to speak, is because I want to promote and promulgate truth, and I see, and yet I guess there's this other way of looking at it, like, well, these people over here are saying all these like social justice warrior types are saying all these, way out crazy, ridiculous things. So let's just troll them by, saying something that we know will make them upset. And I see. I mean, I'm trying to be really even-handed here because I see the appeal of that, and it appeals to me to just to get in somebody's face and say something that will just drive them crazy. If it's a totally unreasonable person and somebody who wants to control all our lives and wants to make us miserable, that kind of terrible person that we see, unfortunately, out there so much. The thing is, I would say that most people who think of themselves as liberal are not this kind of social SJW stereotype, like SJW from hell kind of person. Most of them are more reasonable people than that, and they buy into a lot of ideas that I think are false or wrong, that we would all disagree with, but they're not terrible people. They're not bad people in and of themselves, and I see there's something in, if you overplay this hand, if you get this trolling type of thing where you're just like, well, all these people on the left are just beyond help, beyond reason. All we can do is just mock them. So there's absolutely no limits. Let's just take it to them, and then you end up seeing these kinds of things. And again, the best example I can think of are things like where they talk about the little black kid who fell into the gorilla pit and say something like, well, he's the real gorilla, or these kind of memes where they frankly is insulting to black people, or this other thing where it's like, oh, look at this neocon, or this or whatever, whoever he is, with his adopted black grandson or adopted Ethiopian daughter, we cuck, blah blah blah. I mean, I think these kinds of, if this is our response, then and it's not just a tactical thing, but we are alienating people who are, who maybe are inclined to disagree with us, but who are also able to listen to reason. So there's a tactical reason, but not to overplay that hand. But also, I'd say there's something just wrong in itself. It's like you're just there's something more. It shouldn't just be about picking at scabs and making this miserable culture even more miserable by making it even more contentious and cruel. I mean, there's got to be a limit to that. There's got to be, and I don't see anyone putting the brakes on, in certain segments of the alt-right today. Maybe the ones that are getting the more notice, the more attention, the kind of sites that the New York Times are writing scolding articles about. They're just taking it and running with it, and a lot of it is funny, and a lot of it is clever, and I see the value in some of it, but I really see a danger in the extremes to which it's taken, and just this kind of mentality like, well, we don't have to reason at all. All we have to do is just mock and be insulting and as cruel as there's no depths to which we be as insulting as we want, as cruel as we want, because everybody that is against us is just this obnoxious SJW type. So I mean, I see a problem in that mindset.
Yeah, yeah. I think it's probably about time to close out. Thanks for joining us tonight, Andy, Colin, and Keith Preston. It's been a really interesting conversation. This is Todd Lewis, host of the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.